Bueno, buenos días y bienvenidos al Museo de Arte Moderno de Bogotá y a este conversatorio donde tenemos un invitado muy especial, el director del Programa Internacional del MoMA, Jay Levenson. Bienvenido, Jay. Como dije antes, la conferencia va a ser en inglés. Los que tenemos servicio de traducción simultánea, los que necesiten, con gusto, Fernando estará pues ayudándolos. Jay Levenson se desempeña como presente director del Programa Internacional en el Museo de Arte Moderno de Nueva York desde 1996, donde allí dirige los programas de intercambio e investigación del museo con instituciones de otros países. Antes de eso, fue director adjunto de administración de programas en el Guggenheim Museum en Nueva York, donde ayuda a preparar exposiciones tan importantes como el arte de un continente y China de 5.000 años. Ha sido comisario invitado de varias exposiciones, entre ellas Circa 1492, El arte en la era de la exploración 1991, La edad del barroco en Portugal 1993 para la Galería Nacional de Arte y Abarcando el mundo Portugal y el mundo en sus siglos XVI y XVII para la Galería Arthur Sackler en Washington. Graduado de Yale School y del Colegio de Leyes también de Yale y galardonado con un PhD en Historia de Arte por el Instituto de Bellas Artes de la Universidad de Nueva York. Ha ocupado cargos como curador y administrador de museo. Muchas gracias y bienvenido, Jay.
Gracias. Thank you. So I'll be talking about, can you hear me? Is okay? Okay. So I'll be talking about the relationship between my museum, Museum of Modern Art, or MoMA, and Colombia over the years. It's a relationship that goes back 75 years to the very earliest acquisitions of works of art by Colombian artists. And, oh wait, let me turn this off. I don't need this. Can I turn, you can just turn that off, thanks. Thanks. Okay, good, thanks. It extends right to the present. So I'll outline this history for you in the lecture, and then I'll also focus on my own department, the International Program, which was founded in 1952. It played a role in this history, first by organizing exhibitions that circulated in Latin America, including Colombia, and more recently in overseeing MoMA's curatorial research on Latin America. But first, I'd like to start at the very beginning of our relationship with Latin American art that goes back to the first years of the museum. Then I'll discuss our first acquisitions of art from Colombian artists, then the years where we sent exhibitions to Colombia, including and principally to this museum, Mambo. And then I'll talk about this new chapter in our relationship with Latin America and Colombia that began around the time I joined the museum staff in the later 1990s. So let's go to the first slide. Oh, so that's the outline, sorry. So here is the origins of MoMA. So the museum was founded in 1929, just after the stock market crash, by 3 collectors who were all women. I think I've got them here. Yeah, they were friends, and they believed that the Metropolitan Museum wasn't paying enough attention to modern and contemporary art. One of these ladies, the one at the center, Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, was the mother of Nelson and David Rockefeller, and also the wife of John D. Rockefeller, Jr., who was the richest man in the world at that time. So it was very providential that she was involved at that time in the creation of MoMA, and we've been fortunate that the Rockefeller family has been behind the museum ever since. They hired a brilliant director, a young man, Alfred Barr. You see him at the left as a young man, and then at the right, much later in his career, wearing a hand-painted tie that was actually mailed to him from France by Pablo Picasso. We have in our archives, you see it in the center, the hand-lettered envelope in which Picasso sent the tie, and it just says, Monsieur Alfred Barr, Musée Modern Art, New York, and amazingly it reached him. We had a very good postal service then, I think. So let me just go back here. The museum actually was started in rented space in an office museum at 57th Street and Fifth Avenue. At the left, you can see it in a postcard from the 1920s. The neighborhood looks, as you probably know, a lot different now. So it was a few blocks down from the Plaza Hotel, and the building's still there today. The bottom floor is the Bulgari jewelry shop. You may have passed it when you're in New York. So it was in that museum that we had our first Latin American exhibition, and that was of Diego Rivera. It was actually only the second show, single artist show in the history of the museum. The first was Henri Matisse, and it was in 1931. It included 143 works by Rivera. But because he was famous for his frescoes, he was actually invited to paint what he called portable murals on big cement blocks to show his fresco technique. And in addition to the works that were borrowed, he executed 8 of those murals right in the MoMA space. And you can see him on the left in front of his mural of the agrarian leader Zapata. It later entered MoMA's collection, so that's the painting at the right. It looks virtually the same. Fresco is a very durable technique, and it ages very well. So we still have one of them. The others have gotten scattered. And we always had very scholarly exhibitions. That's the catalog of Rivera's show, and it has illustrations of all the works and 35 pages of scholarly introduction. So in 1932, MoMA got its own space. It was a townhouse that the Rockefellers owned on 53rd Street, right where the museum is today. And since it received a major group of paintings from Lily Bliss, one of the founders, she left them to the museum when she died, they were looking to build a permanent collection. The founding director, Alfred Barr, thought the structure of the collection would be like a torpedo moving through time, was the way he described it. On the right is his diagram. And he thought it would encounter the new at the front and then jettison the old at the back. And his idea actually was that after 50 years, the works of art wouldn't be modern and should either be sold to the Metropolitan Museum if they had become classics, or they should simply be sold on the market to buy new works. And in fact, in the 1950s, we sold a group of significant paintings to the Metropolitan following that idea, but nobody really liked the idea of a collection that kept turning over so frequently. So the philosophy changed after that. But I wanted to point out in his torpedo, let me just find it. Right at the very front, in addition to Europe and America, he has Mexicans, meaning the Mexican muralists. So really from the start, he always had Latin America in mind as an important part of the collection. Rivera wasn't the only Latin American artist to paint frescoes at MoMA. Actually, there was a huge show of Mexican art in 1940 that took over the entire museum. And by that time, we had a new building. And Jose Clemente Rosco was invited to paint a mural in the lobby of the museum. And you can see him at work here with an assistant. It's called Dive Bomber and Tank, and obviously reflects the political situation at the very beginning of the Second World War. You can see the tail and wings of a bomber. Also, someone's upturned feet here. There's the tread of a tank. He said it wasn't meant to be political. It was just showing the life of today. A little hard to believe that. But also, he said the 6 panels could be moved around into any configuration. But to my knowledge, it's always shown that way today and ever since. So let me move to the second chapter of the talk, which is the beginning of MoMA's collection of Latin American art and the start of our acquisition of works by Colombian artists. Nelson Rockefeller, who was Abby's son and a trustee of MoMA, played a very key role. He had become head of the Office of the Coordinator of Inter-American Affairs in the American government. So he was in charge of relations with Latin American countries. And since the outbreak of war in 1941, these relationships have become very important because, among other things, Argentina and Brazil stayed neutral in the Second World War until quite late in the war. So Rockefeller began on his own from his government positions sending exhibitions to Latin America, but he couldn't get funding from the American Congress to consider the project. There were congressmen who thought modern and contemporary art was a field that was too controversial, and they thought they'd be wasting taxpayers' money to send exhibitions around. So his next project in 1942 was undertaken together with MoMA. He was going to send a curator to Latin America, to South America actually, who would acquire works for the collection and who would also do some spying, find out what the Germans were up to in Latin America and how effective the American embassies were in advancing the American cause. He also donated funds to set up a special acquisition fund for Latin American art. It was called the Inter-American Fund, and that actually stayed in existence for years, funding acquisitions at MoMA of Latin American art. So as his representative, oh, sorry, that was the outline. As his representative, he picked the young Lincoln Kirstein. I have him identified with the red arrow. So he was already connected to MoMA as an advisor, and he was already very well known as a connoisseur of contemporary art. When he was a student at Harvard, he co-founded the Society for Contemporary Art, and he'd already mounted significant art exhibitions in Harvard as a student. Later on, he became much more famous as the founder of the New York City Ballet. He was the one who brought George Balanchine to New York. So here he is at the opening of a show in 1943 that featured the works that he had bought in South America, as well as Mexican and Cuban works that MoMA had acquired in those years. And he's standing, of course, in front of Diego Rivera's mural, which MoMA had acquired by then. He'd already been drafted into the American Army, and he was actually going to become one of the so-called monuments men in Europe. And this was a team of soldiers who searched for the works that the Germans had stolen from museums and private collections in Germany and tried to return them to their owners. And actually, Kirstein himself discovered the Ghent altarpiece by Jan van Eyck that had been stolen from Ghent and was hidden in a salt mine near Salzburg. There was a movie you may have seen called The Monuments Men. It was based on this history. And Kirstein was portrayed, but under a different name, by the actor Bob Balaban. Unfortunately, Bob Balaban is short and kind of goofy looking. Doesn't look very much like Kirstein, who was tall and very elegant. I met him sort of much later on in his life. And in fact, he looked a lot more like, certainly later on, like this. That's a portrait that he commissioned from Jamie Wyeth, Andrew Wyeth's son. It's now in the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, but that's really more the image that he kind of liked to present of himself. So his trip began in May of 1942, and it lasted 4 weeks. He went to Sao Paulo, Buenos Aires, Montevideo, Santiago de Chile, Lima, and finished up in Bogota. He met many, many artists, but Gustavo Buntinx, who's a Peruvian art historian, likes to say, sort of has explained, that Kirstein mostly met artists who had leftist politics through various friends of his. And so most of the acquisitions he made were of politically left artists. There were artists like Schul Solar in Buenos Aires who weren't interested in politics, and he never got to meet them. So Buntinx used to say that the only sort of remnants of socialism in the Western Hemisphere, this was before Chavez, were Cuba and the permanent collection of Latin American art at MoMA. So in Bogota, Kirstein focused on the artists that he considered to be young and emerging, and he acquired landscapes like Savannah and Bogota by Gonzalo Ariza. Here's another painting of, he acquired La Ciudad Dorada and a self-portrait lithograph by Luis Alberto Acuna. from Erwin Krauss, who was a jeweler, who also was a watercolorist. He acquired Ravine, the watercolor on the left, and the painting of Savannah. And he felt he discovered the naive artist Alfonso Ramirez Fajardo, who taught at an elementary school and made drawings. And he acquired these two drawings from him. Now, I am hardly an expert on Colombian artists of this period. I would love to learn from someone who knows what they think of Lincoln Kirstein's choices. Alfred Barr must have had reservations because actually only Arisa's Savannah and Acuña's self-portrait have formally entered MoMA's collection. The other works are owned by MoMA still, but they're in our study collection, which consists of works about which we haven't made up our mind yet. So anyway, that's the first chapter of our Colombian acquisitions. Interestingly, in the we kept buying, of course, and in the 1950s, we acquired, among other things, these two works, Edgar Negret's Sign for an Aquarium, the sculpture on the left, and Eduardo Ramirez Villamizar's black and white drawing. And those were actually the two first acquisitions of geometric abstraction art from Latin America. And that field, much later, became a very important part of our collection with donations from Patricio Cisneros' collection. But actually, the two first works of geometric abstraction were Colombian. We also, we also acquired our first Botero. I don't have the slide here, I think, unless it's gotten out of sequence, in 1961, Mona Lisa, age 12. And that was followed by works by Omar Rayo, Augusto Rivera, Leonel Góngora, Santiago Cardenas, Carlos Rojas, Miguel Angel Rojas, and others. We'll look at some of the newer acquisitions later on in the talk. But I'd like to move on now to the third chapter. So that is a period roughly corresponding to the period of the show upstairs, El Arte de la Desobediencia, from the 50s through into the 80s. And the major activity then was our international program, my department, and the various shows that we circulated throughout Latin America. So let's see here. So the international program was founded in 1952, and it was specifically intended to circulate exhibitions, mostly from MoMA's collection, but not exclusively, and they were meant to go throughout the world. But sometimes it also brought foreign exhibitions to MoMA. That's the press release on the left about the formation of the international program. Because the first show it sent was a show of American artists that was sent to Paris. It was actually the brainchild of Nelson Rockefeller and René Darnoncourt, who, let me just show, they're here. That's Rockefeller next to Alfred Barr. And there's René Darnoncourt. He was a very tall man, so he was stooping over, I guess, to listen to Nelson Rockefeller. He was from a very distinguished Viennese family. Actually, the conductor, Nicolas Darnoncourt, is a relative of his. They lost their money in the 1930s, so he was sent to Mexico. I think he was a chemist, and I think the idea was that he was meant to get involved with oil exploration, but the idea was he would help the family rebuild its fortunes. I guess, unfortunately for them, he became much more interested in art. And he found pre-Columbian works for Nelson Rockefeller's collection. Rockefeller was a very avid collector of what was then called primitive art. And also at that time, Mexico hadn't passed export laws, so you could actually legally bring things to the United States from Mexico. So he would have been involved with many of the Mexican works that now are in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, because Rockefeller gave his collection to the Metropolitan years ago. He also started working at an American-owned bookstore in Mexico City. And that was the place where the Mexican muralists sold their easel paintings. So he became friendly with the Mexican muralists, and he was the one who curated the 1940 exhibition of 20 centuries of Mexican art, where Orozco painted his fresco. So Darnacourt was already very familiar with, I don't know if all of Latin America, but certainly at least with Mexico. And Rockefeller, of course, had ties through his family throughout Latin America, and this whole experience of the war years where he was in charge of relationships. The third person in the international program was the first director, Porter McCrae. And I should say, I'm only the third director. There have only been 2 directors since then. We tend to be very long-term. I'm hoping that means it's because it's a good job, but maybe we just lack imagination. So Rockefeller's idea was that it was MoMA's responsibility to share its collection with the world. This was a period where there weren't very many major museums of international modern art. We had something very special, and he also felt that MoMA had a responsibility to help American art achieve international recognition. He thought that our own government really couldn't do it because that was deep in the grip of the McCarthy period, and he was certain that if the American government officials were in charge of picking the works of art, they would pick all the wrong works. And he was probably right. So MoMA was really taking on, kind of a role that in most countries some government or government-affiliated organization would take on, like Goethe House for Germany or the British Council. But I should also point out that there is a theory, it's widely accepted, it's hard to prove, that all of this was done in cooperation with the CIA. That the CIA wanted a cultural offensive, which definitely is true. The CIA did sponsor cultural initiatives, and sometimes secretly, in this period. But the particular focus of that idea is that what the CIA wanted was for America to be known as the home of abstract expressionism, because Soviet art at that period was exclusively socialist realism. I mean, Soviet artists could not officially do anything else, and the idea was, if we showed American abstract art, which nobody could really understand, that would show that our artists were free to do anything they wanted, as opposed to Soviet artists who were forced by their government to work in a particular style. Now, in fact, nobody has found real documents that can prove that collaboration, and actually many of the artists you'll see that were circulated international weren't actually abstract expressionists. But it does seem clear that whether or not there was a connection with the CIA, the MoMA officers and curators and trustees knew they were working in a very charged international political environment, and they must have known that the program would have real political consequences. But actually the art they circulated was very much the same art that they showed at MoMA. I sometimes think that when I retire, I'll file a Freedom of Information Act request with the American government and try to see if there are any CIA documents, relating to the international program. But I have a good friend who worked at the CIA his entire career, and he said I could try, but the problem would be all the documents from those years ended up under some mountain way out west, and they weren't cataloged terribly well. So although they wouldn't be, no one would care about releasing them now, no one might be able to find them either. So we'll see what happens. Let's take a look at the exhibitions that actually went to Colombia in those years. So that was, I divided them up into 3 decades. They fit on the slides pretty well that way. So the program got off to kind of a slow start in the 1950s. The first show was a print exhibition, and then the second was a famous photography exhibition called The Family of Man. I don't have photographs of it here, but it was organized by the photographer Edward Steichen, who was curator of photographs at MoMA at this period. It was circulated to many, many locations around the world. Actually, some of the circulation was done through the American State Department. The photographs in the exhibition were all printed for the exhibition. So they ended up having 3 different sets of photographs that went everywhere. It's estimated that 7 million people ended up seeing the show, which would mean it was the most seen exhibition in the history of modern museums. It was kind of like a feel-good show. It was a competitive show. Photographers were invited to send in photographs, and there was a jury that selected them and arranged them into categories like birth and family and love and death, and showing that people were the same, the world over. So it was a very kind of 1950s idea. So it's not surprising that the show, got to Bogota too. But things started to change in the, there we go, in the 60s rather. That's the period when Gloria Sea took over at Mambo. The schedule became almost frenetic. I tried to highlight in red the shows that traveled to Mambo, but I realized this morning I missed a few on the next slide. But anyway, so this was the first decade. And you can see it's a mix of figurative art, architecture, and some of it, in fact, is abstract. But it's the 1970s that are actually the most interesting. There we go. Here we go. It becomes almost frenetic. And I missed a few of the exhibitions that actually went to Mambo. Gloria was actually a member of the International Council. And I haven't, sort of done research in actual communications, but I'm sure that was one of the reasons why Mambo got so many of these circulating exhibitions. There were 12 exhibitions in all, and sometimes actually 2 exhibitions at a time showing at Mambo. And a lot of the shows traveled to Cali, Medellin, even Pereira. Interestingly, most of the shows weren't focused on abstract expressionism. The one that was this one, which we'll look at more carefully, Color as Language. But a lot of the artists represented were from quite different schools. You can see Alexander Calder, Surrealism, Miro, Picasso, Bacon, Dubuffet. Well, he was abstract, but not New York school. Giacometti, the photographer Brassai. This is probably also a good place that I should say more about our International Council. It was the donors group that was formed in 1953, basically to finance my department, although since then it's been active in financing other international activities at MoMA. It has a long history with Colombia too. I mean, through Gloria Sea. But it wasn't just Colombia that the International Council was close to. David Rockefeller was president of the museum during some of these years, and he had many contacts in Latin America. So we had a very distinguished group of Latin American members throughout this period. The council takes a trip every spring, and actually in 1973 the group visited Bogota, and they were hosted by Gloria Sea and by Beatriz and Julio Mario Santo Domingo. And the visit ended with a reception at the Palacio Carlos that was hosted by President Pastrana Borrero, whom we'll actually see in a bit. So let me go to the third slide of exhibitions. And the point I wanted to make was, unfortunately, this slightly frenetic activity, or at least it looks that way from our perspective, sort of died down later on. Fewer exhibitions, and as far as I can see, there hasn't been a major exhibition since 1990. I've got to just double check that. So it's probably time to look again at bringing more MoMA shows to Colombia. So let's look at a few of these exhibitions in more detail through some historical photographs. Fortunately for us, MoMA always asks the museums to send numerous photographs of their installations. So we have a very good archive of photographs. So let's see. So here's the Alexander Calder show we were looking at in 1970. And and included, as you can see, some very monumental works, the stay bills. And among other works. This was a very interesting exhibition for modern masters. That's the catalog at the upper right, the upper left rather. And I found a slide of the Francis Bacon section, and among the paintings you can see on the left is this study for his painting of a pope. Very well-known work. It's often displayed at MoMA, and some of the other works were borrowed from other American collections. And then, in 1975, our very distinguished curator, Kinnison McShine, who just died this past year, organized an exhibition on abstract expressionism called Color as Language. And it included many works from many collections besides MoMA's. It wasn't one of these collection-only exhibitions. I found, here's in our archives, the original invitation from Mambo, and then at the left, two of the MoMA works that were included in the show, a Jackson Pollock and a Rothko. So I just wanted to make the point that we were sending, very significant works, not only to Colombia, but actually around the world at this period. And, sometimes I've noticed to museums that clearly did not have climate control. It was a different world altogether as far as exhibitions. At this time, these works were valuable, but nowhere near as valuable as they are now. So insurance wasn't the big problem that it is now. And also, I think nobody thought that modern and contemporary art had any conservation issues because they were thought to be brand new paintings. And so I don't think there were terrible concerns about whether the venue was air conditioned, and of course that's all changed. It's much more difficult now to send major paintings to exhibitions like this. I couldn't find a review by Marta Traba of this particular exhibition. We have in our archives reviews of the exhibition that include things that she wrote for various papers. But I did find a short piece about a conference that she organized in conjunction with this exhibition at Mambo. And it said the conference would be sobre la importancia y valor de una exposición que, según sus, meaning Marta's, palabras, de hacer historia en Colombia. So she at least thought this was a very important exhibition for the local art scene. So let me show some, so let me go to the next slide. It appears we also made other loans of works to outside of these exhibitions, because this is a very well-known Picasso of ours, Three Women. It's a work of 1921, and apparently it was on view at the opening of the Calder show. That's the folder I found it in at MoMA in 1970. And this is President Pastrana Borrero and his wife looking at our painting. So MoMA's focus on Latin America kind of drifted in the 1980s and early 1990s. It didn't disappear altogether. The second director of the international program, Waldo Rasmussen, actually organized a major Latin American art exhibition in the early 1990s. It was first shown in Seville to celebrate the Columbus anniversary in 1992, and it went to Paris and Cologne and then came back to MoMA in 1993. I don't think it had a big selection of Colombian art, but it of course included Botero. But I'd like to concentrate more on a new phase. Here we go. A new phase in MoMA's relationship with Latin America that began in the later 1990s, around the time that I joined MoMA's staff. For the first time ever, in 1999, we appointed a curator specializing in Latin American art, and that was the Brazilian Paulo Erkanoff, who had just completed the São Paulo Bienal, and he stayed with us 3 years in MoMA. Actually, he told us, after you've curated a Biennale, it's a very good time to leave Brazil for a while. So I think it worked out very well for him, too. He was succeeded by Luis Enrique Pérez Oramas, a Venezuelan, and he was actually curator until last year, and he's very recently been replaced by Inés Katzenstein of Argentina. And Latin America is still the only world region that has its own specialist curator at MoMA. So things really began to change, once we had a Latin American curator on board. Just to give you an idea of some of the big exhibitions we started to do, we had a major exhibition on the Venezuelan artist Armando Reveron in 2007, and that was organized by our chief paintings curator, John Elderfield. We also had, these are just slides from 4 other exhibitions, a Diego Rivera show that brought together some of the portable murals that he painted at MoMA in 1931, together with some of the historical studies for them. Also, on the upper right, a show pairing the Brazilian Mira Schendel with the Argentine painter Leon Ferrari, draftsman Leon Ferrari, a show on the Brazilian Lydia Clark at the lower right, and a show on Joaquin Torres Garcia from Uruguay. And the most recent of these shows, there we go, on Tarsila do Amaral, it just closed recently, the Brazilian modernists. So that was a major change in our programming, a real series of major monographic shows on figures from the history of Latin American art. We've also entered a very new stage in our collection, and a lot of it has to do with the generosity of our trustee, Patricio Cisneros. She has been giving us works from her collection all along, but recently she donated the most important works in her collection of Latin American geometrical abstraction. It covers Venezuela, Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay. But as you can see from the press release, over here, she also donated funds to establish a research institute on Latin American art at MoMA. And Inés Katzenstein is going to direct that, and we're currently in the formation of that institute. We'll have our first advisory board meeting actually next week. Just to remind you, the real strength of the Cisneros collection is Brazilian and Argentine geometrical abstraction, like this work by Geraldo de Barrios. She also, and this is also important, helped form in 2006 a committee of patrons who would financially support the acquisition of Latin American art at MoMA. And that's really led to exceptional growth and expansion of our Latin American collection. Since the later 1990s, there have been numerous acquisitions of works by Colombian artists. In fact, I got a complete list of all our Colombian holdings, and the number is actually 761. That's a bit misleading because some things are series of photographs or prints, and you probably really think of them as one work. And some are individual works that form part of an installation. But nonetheless, it's a significant number. Just to take a look at some of these, one of our earliest acquisitions was the Dora Salcedo piece at the left, and we've acquired more of her works and featured her in installations in our permanent collection. We've also acquired works by Beatriz Gonzalez, and this crib was actually part of a really interesting exhibition we did 3 years ago called Transmissions, that focused on links between Latin American and Eastern European artists in the 1960s and 1970s. We own works by Santiago Cardenas. We recently bought a sculpture by Felisa Burstein. We have a very nice representation of works by Jose Antonio Suarez Lodoño, including this wonderful notebook of his. Also works by, wait, I jumped across here. Yeah, by Oscar Munoz and Miguel Angel Rojas. Joana Kaya on the upper left and Nicolas Paris on the right, and major installations by Gabriel Sierra and Mateo Lopez, just to give you an overview. This morning I realized that I should mention other names as well, just in case anybody felt left out. I sort of picked these photographs somewhat at random. So, I mean, the list includes the people you'd expect: Rosenberg Sandoval, Alvaro Barrios, Raymond Chavez, Bernardo Ortiz Campo, Carlos Mota. So it's really a growing collection, but already a very strong one. My own department has taken a different sort of route towards encouraging interest in Latin America and in Colombia. We've focused on curators and research. And we no longer circulate exhibitions the way we did in the 60s and 70s and 80s. That activity has been transferred to our Department of Exhibitions. And the mission that we've come up with is to connect the museum essentially to the world outside of Western Europe. So we've been focusing on Latin America, Asia, Eastern Europe, and Africa through a number of different programs. Oh, I'm sorry, I just wanted to show one more. This was an exhibition of recent acquisitions that we had, which had, why is not going? Yeah, they had photographs by Leo Matisse that are on the wall over there. Sorry, I just got out of sequence. So here we are in our activities. So the first project that we sort of organized was in 1998. We started a series of workshops for museum professionals, and our first workshop was on Latin America, and we included Jose Roca, looking very young there. He was then at the Biblioteca Luis Angel Arango, and he told me that the color's not right in that photograph. He's going to be very embarrassed when you show him the photographs of it. He said it was actually green, but it was quite bright, and he only realized after he arrived that in New York everyone wears black, and that he should have dressed differently. So we continued this program for several years and covered Eastern Europe, Asia, and Africa, and then we revived it a few years ago in a slightly different form. So that's one of our classes at the right. We now include curators in each group from all over the world, and we also include MoMA curators it's a 2-week program. The program itself, we've kind of professionalized it. It focuses very much on management training, and the courses are given by Columbia Business School professors. So it's actually a very expensive program for us, but we feel it really has value for the people who are participating in it. And in 2016, you can see Emiliano Valdez from Medellin, from the Museo de Arte Moderno. That program is going on. It's one of the ways that we are able to interact with museums around the world, but also, of course, in Latin America. Then we also started a publications program we call Primary Documents. We publish translated texts about modern art in different parts of the world. So writings like artists' manifestos, early criticism, and so on. And we've actually published 9 volumes in this series, and 3 already have dealt with Latin America. The first, Listen Here Now, was on Argentina in the 1960s, which is a very important decade for Argentine art. The second one was on the critic Alfredo Boulton and on Venezuelan modern art. And the third was on the writings of Mario Pedrosa, who was the leading Brazilian art critic after the Second World War. And actually the 2 first titles were published, not by us, but by foundations in Argentina and Venezuela in the original Spanish. Also in 2007, we started a new program that now accounts for most of our activity. It's called CMAP, Contemporary and Modern Art Perspectives. And we have 4 groups of curators and other MoMA staff who conduct research on Latin America, Eastern Europe, Asia, and Africa. They hear a variety of experts in New York on the fields they're studying, and they travel at least once a year to the place they're studying. it's interesting, there aren't any specific expectations of results from CMAP. It's basically meant to be pure research with the idea that if it's successful, the people in the program will come up with ideas for programs, for initiatives. And actually, we've counted over 1,100 acquisitions in MoMA that we think would not have taken place except for CMAP research, and it's had influence on 19 exhibitions. So it really has made a change. Each group has a senior curator as a group leader and a graduate fellow who works with the leader. And for 3 years, we were lucky to have in our Latin American group Jerónimo Duarte Riascos. I show him at the right with Mateo Lopez. He's finishing his PhD at Harvard, but it gave us a real leg up on connections with Colombia. And the Latin American trip, in fact, took its first trip to Colombia in 2016. I had brought some curators several years before to Colombia, but that was relatively a small trip, and this was quite a big one. It was, I think, something like 14 people who were in the group. So to prepare for the trip, we scheduled 12 seminars or workshops at MoMA for the group in the months before, we usually do these at lunchtime. And as you'll see, we got a very good cross section of curators, artists, museum people, historians. The idea was our curators, went to graduate school at a time when. In their field, you basically studied Europe and North America. So very few of them have either the knowledge or the language they would need on their own to work in Latin American art, Asian art, African art. So these seminars and workshops, and they come together with recommended readings, are a way for our curators to get to feel comfortable working in areas of the world that they haven't really studied on their own. So that's the reason for this intense preparation. And then that's Jose Roca talking to one of the workshops in New York. You can see everybody has lunch because to make it easier for people to attend, we generally schedule these at the middle of the day and offer lunch. Otherwise, it's hard to get a group of 15 people together. So that's actually the schedule that Jerónimo put together for the 9 days in Colombia. It was, I would call it an odyssey. It took us to Medellin, Cali, Pereira, where we saw the Salón Nacional, and we finished up in Bogotá. The group was led by Jerónimo with Luis Pérez Romas and also Alexa Halabi of the Cisneros collection. So we had two sort of on-the-ground Colombian people working with us. I still can't believe when I look at that schedule that we made all of these appointments, but we actually did. Even though, over here, I don't know if you can see it. Yeah, you can't, the type is too small. When we left Pereira in the middle of the night, or we tried to leave Pereira in the middle of the night, Bogotá was clouded in. We couldn't, our flight was canceled. We were in the middle of nowhere, and somehow we were able to convince Avianca to get us on a flight the next morning, I think from Armenia. And Jerónimo found us a hotel in the middle of nowhere where we got at 3 o'clock in the morning. So that was the only rough spot, but we did make all of the appointments. So let me just show you a few of the slides from that trip. So we were in Taller Siete in Medellin. You can see us there enjoying a cafecito. And we visited Jose Antonio Solis Lodoño at his studio, and he very nicely has a small printing press there, and he very nicely pulled a sample print from one of his plates. He's very interested in making sure people understand the printing process. We met with Alberto Sierra Maya at Galería La Oficina in Medellin, and we saw Oscar Munoz at Lugar a Dudas in Cali. When we got to Bogotá, we visited, among others, Miguel Angel Rojas at his home, and also Nicolas Paris, there he is, at his home. And of course, we visited many more artists, museums, art galleries, Mambo in particular. It's the sort of trip that's so important for our curators in getting direct contact with the place, and with the artists and the professionals. We also sort of make some of this research available more widely on a website that we maintain called post.at.moma.org. So we can post information. Sometimes we put recordings of lectures. Sometimes we put reports of our own travels. So this is an interview that we conducted with Jose Roca when he was at MoMA. Here's another article by Luis Perez Ramos on our acquisition of works by Nicolas Paris. So that's also another important channel we have of disseminating information about our research. So I wanted to conclude with this slide. So it's the first work of Colombian art that we acquired, the Arisa Savannah, back in the 1940s. And this is an architectural drawing by Guillermo Bermudez that we acquired. It's our most recent acquisition. And it appeared in a major survey exhibition of Latin American architecture at MoMA in 2015. So it's a long and varied history, and I'm certain we're ready for a new chapter. And I'm happy to say that I spent part of my time here in Bogota talking to Claudia Akim and her wonderful staff at Mambo about ways that we can work on projects together in the future. And I'm planning to come back for Artbo in a month. So thank you very much for being here. And do we have time for some questions? And I'd be very happy to take any questions. I just warn you that some of this research no one had done before, so it's in our archives. So what I've shown you is probably most of what I know. So, but I'd be happy to answer any questions.
¿Alguna pregunta del público?
Well, I wonder, how do you see the relationship between the conflict of Colombia and the MoMA? How does the institution see it?
It's an interesting question. I first came to Bogota probably in 1989, when it was a very different city. There were a lot of policemen with machine guns around, and so I personally was aware of the situation. I'd say that was probably one of the reasons why in the later 1980s and 90s there wasn't much going on between the two between MoMA and institutions here. But it had one interesting outcome. Jose Roca says most foreigners just didn't go to Colombia in the 80s and 90s. And so by the time they started coming back, in the 2000s, they were discovering several generations of artists who weren't so well known outside of Colombia because Colombia didn't have an international presence. And he thinks it's one of the reasons why Colombia suddenly shot up internationally, because it was a kind of a rediscovery. So I'd say that's probably also a reason why our acquisitions sort of died out for a while and started out again. So I don't know. I think people are quite ready now to travel to Colombia, and I'm sure that the trip we took in 2 years ago, left everybody with a very good impression of the country. I mean, we were very much aware that a lot of the political art was focused on la violencia, and we understand that, and that's an important chapter, and it's very well represented in our collection now. But we also realize that a lot more is going on too.
I guess you've been in Colombia many times. And
just 4, but still.
4. But still, the country since a couple of years ago. And so I wonder, from your point of view, how has the art scene changed since the 60s or since the first time you came to now? And also from your point of view, how has the country in general changed and the Colombian society?
Well, when I was here in 1989, I have to say I did feel a little nervous, and it was sort of just the way the city was, at that time. I mean, I really do not consider myself, an expert on the history of art here. But one thing, that's become very clear, there were certainly several generations of artists whose focus was principally on reacting to and documenting the violence. And it's entirely understandable. It was interesting, we visited Santiago Cardenas's studio, and it was interesting that he represents sort of like an earlier generation. I think he trained at Yale in the same class as Richard Serra, and his interests are very formal. So it became clear there are certainly other currents in Colombian art that don't have to do with, political art. And then, we've noticed some of the younger artists also are not so much interested in political developments and more in formal concerns. And, so I'd say, probably everybody who traveled with me got a sense of a variety of different themes in Colombian art. And, and also of an historical development. There were times when things were really bad, but, things were also improving. And so I'd say we've all become sort of more nuanced students of Colombian history.
I would like to ask you how the acquisitions are established. Is it the curators that ask for works in order to be considered by, is there a committee, or how is the process, for deciding these works that you've shown us?
Sure. So it's actually a very interesting process because our museum is divided into departments by medium. So there's a department of painting and sculpture, a department of prints and drawings, a department of architecture and design, a department of film, a department of media and performance, and I'm leaving out one. Photography, of course. We were the first major museum that had a photography collection. So each department, for years, each department had its own special exhibition galleries, and you would mostly see photographs in the photography department galleries. The original idea, clearly, of the founders of the museum was, well, art is painting and sculpture. Of course, the artists make drawings before, as preparatory for the paintings and sculpture, and then they make prints to publicize the paintings and sculpture. So that's sort of a subsidiary department, and artists' books are also collected in that department. And then photography is different. Film is different. Architecture and design is its own area. So they thought everything should be exhibited pretty much separately. In fact, I remember we had a big Jasper John show almost 20 years ago, and he's important not only as a painter but also as a printmaker. But we had two separate exhibitions, one on his painting with his preparatory drawings and one on his prints, and they actually traveled separately. So now we're getting back to the idea, especially as a lot of contemporary artists work in all sorts of media interchangeably and incorporate different media in their works, we're getting back to the idea of exhibiting things together. Although I think we still think that architecture and design has a somewhat different trajectory, and I think that's going to be shown probably separately. However, we still acquire things through each department. So each department has an acquisitions committee that is chaired by one of our trustees, and it's made up of trustees but also of collectors in that field. And the curator finds the object, has it approved by the chief curator in the department, and then presents it at an acquisitions meeting. I think they take place twice a year to this committee, and the committee has to vote on the acquisition. Of course, it's rare that something is turned down because there's a lot of work ahead of time, making the case and talking to committee members. But the committee members, the committees actually pay for these acquisitions. They contribute annual dues for a fund, and then if there's a big work that comes up, It'll be funded maybe by special contributions by the committee or by a deaccession of other works in the department. But we don't have big acquisition funds the way some museums do for whatever reason. We have a large endowment, but that pays for operating costs, not so much for acquisitions. So the complicated thing is, if you have something like that installation by Mateo Lopez, which has video, drawings, probably prints, as well as sculpture, it has to be approved by each committee in each department. And then, so it gets a little bit complicated. And in fact, the Latin American Committee proposes acquisitions, but the actual acquisition has to be approved by the committee that's in charge of that department. So it's a slightly complicated procedure, but it's worked for all these years, so it's probably too early to change it. And collecting, collecting departments are by medium. That's not so much of a surprise because the storage is quite different for different works. So painting and sculpture requires one sort of storage. We have a big facility in Queens. But most of the photographs and works on paper are still stored in the MoMA building. The photography needs refrigerated storage. And the films actually have to be kept in a facility something like 90 miles away in Pennsylvania, because our collection includes early films on acetate stock that are combustible. And the only way you can store, you aren't allowed to store them in a city environment. You have to create, I've been out there and seen them, individual cement containers for each film, so in case it bursts into flame, it doesn't damage anything else. And we send those by Federal Express, the films by Federal Express to New York every day for the for the showings we do in New York.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for being here and all the information that you have shared with us. I would like to know from your perspective and the work that you've been doing from your department in particular, what do you think needs to be done to increase or potentialize those encounters or exchanges between the two museums? What are your ideas on this kind of subject for the future, near future or long term?
Sort of one of the things I've learned sort of in my work is that projects only start when people actually come together in the same room and speak face to face. It seems so weird in a way with all of the means of communication we have now. You can have a Skype conversation on your phone with anybody in the world fairly quickly, but there's something about concrete projects that require people actually to meet. I think maybe it goes back to the Stone Age or something like that, but there's something about that. So I think part of what we need to do is to get more of our people to come here more regularly. It's going to be a little hard to do that right now because our curators are all tied up in a big expansions project in New York. We're expanding our galleries, and they have to they have to reinstall everything. So it'll be harder for them to travel. But also, my department is a good meeting point for people at MoMA. So when anybody comes to MoMA, comes to New York, an artist, I'm perfectly happy if you give out my information to anyone here. I'm happy to meet people from Colombia, and especially people from the different museums. So I think part of it depends upon more personal contact, and then part of it just depends on finding the funding. Back in that time when the International Council was circulating all those exhibitions, the costs were, much, much lower. I don't think anybody was also focused on how much curatorial staff time these projects take, and now we're much more focused on that. So it's just very difficult to kind of grab a curator and try to put them to work on a special traveling exhibition. So most of the shows that that circulate are shows that are first organized from New York. So that type of program I don't think we can revive on that scale. So, but I think we can still do things involving existing exhibitions. We're very generous in individual loans, so people working, on exhibitions should get in touch, and I'm always happy to, make sure the request goes to the right person at MoMA. So I think there are, a variety of different ways, but I think personal meetings are part of it, and I think, Jose Roca's idea that a main part of Colombia's isolation was that people just weren't traveling here in the, in the 80s and 90s, and that's changed now.
Sorry, one more question. If someone is interested in this kind of projects that you are talking about, if there's any case of getting in contact with your department for this kind of works, how do you get in contact with the department? Through the website that you just show us, or
no? You could send me an email. I'm happy to. The people here have my email. It depends entirely. It's hard to get a single individual project going. It's easier if it comes through an institution, through a museum or something like that. But I can see what's possible. That's you never know sometimes.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much.
I think you're supposed, because we're recording this, I think you're supposed to get the microphone.
Jay, which are the research subjects at this moment in your department?
Which are the
research subjects?
Oh, yeah. So it's interesting. We have these different groups. The Latin American group is finishing sort of more than a year's study of the Caribbean, mostly of the Caribbean. So they travel this past year to Cuba. The African group is just getting started, so we don't really have a focus for them. The Asian group is working on South Asia, India, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. And the Eastern European group has been working on the former East Germany. It's interesting, the group started out with a very specific focus. The idea was they would need some research project to get them started. So the first research project for Latin America was actually, it was when Luis Perez Ramos was preparing the Lydia Clark show. So that was their first project, which was an interesting one. Luis knew so much more than anybody in the group. I'm not sure that there wasn't much space for individual curators to make their own discoveries. So, and that group started more or less on a geographical survey of Latin America, but I think that's because we have such a strong Latin American collection that was, that was really possible. The Eastern European group was very interesting. We'd just been given a huge collection of Fluxus art, because MoMA had never collected Fluxus. The previous generation of curators believed it was ephemeral and not really collectible. So when we got that, it included a lot of Eastern European works. So that group started with Fluxus, and then they essentially discovered that Fluxus was only part of a whole range of experimental practices in Eastern Europe that were underground because of the Soviet domination. And so they expanded to a lot of different artists in Eastern Europe. And the Asian group started with a focus on Japan. There was an exhibition being prepared, particularly on performative practices in Japan. And then they moved quickly through Korea and China, but then a new curator came in, Stuart Comer from the Tate, and he had a lot of experience with India. So we had a vote because we're democratic, but the group switched to South Asia, and that's been very successful. The only problem we've had is getting there is very expensive. So, so it's a smaller group than some of the others. And Africa, we're just getting started on. We need the mic.
You said that back in 1999, you hired Herkenhoff, and thus after several curators specialized in Latin America. Why are there these particular kind of special curators for Latin America? And I understand there's going to be even an additional one for the research center. And why particularly with Latin America as opposed to other regions in the world?
That's a very good question. I think it's because we have much more of a history and in Latin America, and a much larger collection than in any other of our international collections, and so it made sense to have somebody specializing in Latin America. I mean, if we could find funding, there might be some interest in other parts of the world. But I think our prevailing thinking has been, it's in some ways more interesting through CMAP to get, for example, several of our curators knowledgeable about South Asia, rather than simply hiring a curator from India. Because ordinarily, if you do that, that's the curator who has all the knowledge, and it doesn't really spread through the museum. I think the idea behind CMAP, this program, is that it's a way of getting knowledge through our staff. Not, we don't think we'll need it forever. The graduate schools now have programs in Latin American art, in Asian art, in African art. So I think the next generation of curators will already have some of this knowledge. It's really the people who've grown up in a period when modern and contemporary art was synonymous with North America and Western Europe. It's they who sort of need that additional training or additional exposure. Now, in the Latin American group, actually, some people have come up with their own missions within Latin American art. So Sarah Meister, one of our curators in photography, she's made it her mission to broaden our collection of Latin American photography. Our previous curator wasn't so interested in Latin America. I finally got him to travel to Brazil, but unfortunately it was after he'd already retired, so it didn't have much impact on the collection. And he had a great time, and I'm hoping he thought, as I did when I went to Brazil later in life, why didn't I come here earlier? But I don't know. But she's actively looking for, broadening our collection, and not just contemporary photography, but going back and acquiring historical photography. Because one of the most interesting things about the history of photography is, I was told this by a curator in Brazil at the Moreira Salles Institute, the technical innovations spread throughout the world so quickly that you can trace the history of photography in most parts of the world. The new cameras got there, people started taking pictures, and he showed me an entire history of Brazilian photography just with Brazilian photographers. So anyway, but Sarah has been working on getting some of that material, collected at MoMA. And some of the other people in the Latin American group have their own. Our architecture show in Latin America, it was also someone who traveled around with Barry Bergdahl, who traveled with the Latin American group. So I think that philosophy has been working. But overall, it still makes sense for us to have a Latin American curator because we really have a sizable collection now. If you think of over 700 Colombian works, I haven't picked the total of everything, but it's a really sizable collection. I think it deserves its own staff.
Hello. Well, I actually have 4 questions more,
Okay.
but I will try to summarize in
Sure.
1 or 2. First of all, I would like to go back to the story, to the spice tales
Sure.
of CIA. Do you have examples or tales, or specifically tales that you can tell us about that?
No, actually, the museum invited Michael Kimmelman, who used to be the art critic for the New York Times, to come to the archives and look through, and he wasn't able to find any documentation, directly. So that's the reason that I think we should look at the CIA files if there's any way of getting at them. Because my thought is maybe I could put in like Porter McRae's name or something, or René Dononcourt and find something. But he wasn't able to find any documentation. I mean, I've seen articles about some old CIA people saying, oh yeah, abstract expressionism, that's what we wanted to spread throughout the world to prove that we were better than the Soviets. But, do you really trust retired CIA officers? I mean, I don't know. But there actually is he Croatian? There's a sort of installation artist who has done his own documentation. He's recreated some of the international program exhibitions with photographs. And it's interesting, there was one exhibition that got, because I know this from his documentation, it was a MoMA show of American painting that got to Vienna. And I think it was a MoMA, someone in the American consulate in Yugoslavia. This was in the 60s or 70s, who wanted to take it to Yugoslavia. And they were able to find funding in the consulate for that. And the Yugoslavian Ministry of Culture immediately accepted, because at the time they were trying to show their independence from Soviet Russia. So they were anxious to have a very non-Soviet show. And in fact, I learned when I went to the former Yugoslavia, Tito funded Yugoslavian artists to travel to New York to learn abstract expressionism, and there is a school of Yugoslavian abstract expressionism that goes back to that. So there's something there, but we don't really have sort of documentation that would make it clearer.
Yeah, like explicit documentation. Yeah. In transmission, you were mentioned transmissions. Mm-hmm. Oh, right.
Yeah, that was really just about artistic connections, not political connections.
Yes, because, I don't know if you know Kitchen's debate of the whole Earth catalog, that they mentioned something like that, and I was curious about it. But I would like to come to the present days. Mm-hmm. Like the New York artistic scene have a very interesting position about the politic. Mm-hmm. So I would like to know more about that. I read some news in New York or in other newspapers from US that artistic New York scene, eventually MoMA has been included with some actions that shows like the disapproval of this president. Can you tell us more about that?
I mean, it's when you look back at some of our historical exhibitions, you can see very clearly that during particularly the last phase of the Vietnam War, the entire artistic community in the United States got very political, and that was reflected in works that were shown at MoMA, and then I'd say the artistic community became very much less political. Maybe it was because they were making so much money at the time, I don't know. So, we haven't done a lot. The thing that we've done that, I think was, I think deservedly got a lot of publicity, when Trump first proposed a travel ban, and I think originally it was 7 countries that were supposed to, lose the right to come to the United States. Several of our curators got very upset, and they proposed a project which was approved. It was approved very quickly, actually, by our board, because the public appearance of the museum is important for the board. We have to make sure that they're on board, so to speak. They looked into our holdings of works by artists from those countries. The list has changed since then, but it was like Sudan, Iran, I forget some of the others. And they put those works on display, and I have to say I'm very proud of them, on the floor that has our Picassos, Matisses, Jackson Pollocks, and they put them right in. So Ibrahim El-Salahi, who is a Sudanese artist who's still alive, he lives in Oxford, Alfred Barr had bought a painting from him in the 1960s, which was shown maybe once and then went into storage. And that came out and ended up in the Picasso gallery, where it looked absolutely fine. And there were, I remember an Iranian work that was on display in the gallery with the abstract expressionists, between Barnett Newman and Pollock, and it looked fine there too. And there was just a fairly modest label explaining that this was our way of showing that free transit of people, throughout the world was an important thing. And so it was done, without a big political, explicit statement, but it was done very nicely, and each of the works had that label, and a lot of them stayed up for about a year. So I'm not sure what else we've done in that direction, but it's complicated for museums to be political. Less so for us because we don't get any government support. But the famous example that gets everybody nervous is when the show of young British artists went to the Brooklyn Museum years ago when Giuliani was mayor, and he was about to run for the Senate. And one of the works was a painting of Madonna by Crisofili, which we now own, actually. But it was shown, I think it was in a private collection then. And Crisofili's style at the time was to attach balls of elephant dung, elephant feces, to dried. Well, eventually dried. He got them from the London Zoo, I think. And they would be attached to the painting because in Nigeria, it was sort of a way of paying tribute. It was an important commodity, and it was a way of showing honor to something. And someone told Giuliani about it. I don't think he went to the Brooklyn Museum. And I think because he was trying to get votes for his campaign for the Senate, which never happened, he said, I will withdraw all the city funding from the Brooklyn Museum immediately. And the Brooklyn Museum gets most of its funding from New York City. So they took him to court immediately, and they won. But it made everybody who gets government funding a little bit nervous about what, sort of controversial things. So I think the museums still, do things that in the end are controversial, but they have to think about it a bit, especially if they're, getting public support about what the reaction's going to be.
My last question.
Of course.
I think my last question, that question that I did brings me to the last question, that I see the museums more critical than I see further educatives. They're concentrated in education more than criticism, I think. I don't know if I'm clear about it. But by the international department part, how do you explore small countries that doesn't have a strong web of artistic scene? I mean, it's easy to talk about Mexico, it's easy to talk about Argentina, it's easy to talk about Brazil, but for example, Belize, Haiti, Panama, I don't know, Bolivia, how have been your approaches to those countries?
Well, we haven't done much there yet. We did actually send a small group to the Ghetto Biennial in Haiti this past year. So we do have some exposure there. And by complete chance, my assistant in my department is working on a graduate degree in Haitian art at City University in New York. But anyway, so that's one area we have done something. We're hoping with this new Cisneros Institute that we'll be able to, make contact with more people. So that is something we're aware of. That most of our contact has been with the larger and more internationally represented countries. But there are also whole parts of the world that we haven't gotten to yet. In Central Asia, people come to us and we have invitations. We have several people in Mongolia who've been asking us to come. So I think we'll get there, but it'll take a while. And our museum is very curator driven. You'll be surprised, but a lot of museums aren't, And so really any project that gets results has to come up from curatorial departments. There has to be at least one curator who's really interested in the project. So for us, it's not enough to get a staff member, including me, to someplace. We have to get a curator someplace because that's the way something can happen. And although we have a lot of curators, they're finite, and at certain times, like now, it's hard to get them to travel. So that's something of a limiting factor, I think. But, I think over time we'll get around that. And I think this new interest in Africa will be, it'll also be very interesting. It'll get more people on board.
Vamos con la última pregunta.
which has been the latest acquisitions that made by the MoMA of works of Colombian artists?
Well, I think that those architectural drawings by Bermudez were the most recent ones. But before that, I think I had the list up on my phone. Let me see if I can find it. So, see if it can load down here.
And also,
I mean, they were the just looking chronologically here. I can show you if I get to the bottom here. Okay, so I'm looking. It was it was a Mateo Lopez installation, prints by Beatriz Gonzalez, photographs by Carlos Mota, prints by Nicolas Paris and Joana Calle, Miguel Angel Cardenas drawings, Felisa Burstein, so a variety of different things. Also architecture drawings, Miguel Angel Rojas, so a variety of different things. Also, we have an interesting project. I wasn't able to show it. Our library committee every year publishes a special edition book, and different artists are invited to contribute. And the book this past year was actually a case. It was called La Valise. It was based on Marcel Duchamp's valises, and it included a number of different works that were all inspired by a book by an Argentine writer whose name I'm now forgetting. And Joana Calle and Nicolas Paris both contributed to that book, which goes to members of our library council and is also sold. So I'd say we still have very vigorous relationships with Colombian artists.
Well, I'm so very happy to hear this lot of questions in this small audience. So I'm very happy that you make a very good research and put together all this research. Thank you, Jay, for taking your time to put all the investigations you make to bring us this lecture. So we're very happy to see that we have a lot of Colombian in your collection, and that you have a very good trip last time you came to Bogota, to Colombia. So I think I feel a very little sorry that the connection with the Mambo and MoMA stops in some point of the past years, but I think it's the time to connect again with the MoMA. And I think this is the first step we're making, that you're here again, that we see that all the connections we used to have, and to work with some museums here in Colombia, to work something with you. And so you will see me maybe next year in your room. As you said, you have to be face to face to do this kind of connection. So thank you very much for coming, for making this research for us. The lecture that you gave us was very interesting. And thank you for the audience that came here and make so many questions and were so attendance to your lecture.
Thank you so much. I learned a lot preparing for this talk too, so thank you for helping that.